Sensitive class. Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Extreme Weather Panel of the Orland Park Public Library, a Kickstarter of our programs in 2021. And I hope everyone is having a lovely evening this fine new year. I would like to start off by saying that if you guys have any questions, please add them in our Q&A section. We will get to them when the time is appropriate, so feel free to add those. We would love to answer those for you. And I am going to start off by introducing to you our moderator, Andy Avalos. Andy Avalos is an American award-winning meteorologist working with NBC5 News. You can see him weekly mornings on NBC5 News today between 4:30 and 7, and catches updates throughout the Today Show. Andy is a resident of Orland Park, actually, and he has worked for the radio and television for more than 30 years. So I send it off to you, Andy.
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. And as we all know, we're talking about the weather and the extremes. And we all know that 2020 was quite a year of extremes. Question is, will 2021 be a year of extremes? And so far, it's certainly starting out that way. But our primary focus this evening is going to be on weather and how it relates to you and perhaps your family and your livelihood and the home that you live in and the community that you live in. We all know that the weather impacts each and every one of us virtually every single day of our lives, some much more so than others. But in one way or another, we're all having to deal with the weather. So I'm not alone to discuss this tonight. In fact, we have a panel of experts who are going to help carry the load, if you will. And by the time all is said and done, hopefully we'll give you some valuable information, make you a little more knowledgeable, a little more weather-wise. You'll be a little more prepared for what lies ahead, not only this year, but in the years ahead. So we're going to go around the board here and take a look at the guests that are joining us tonight. First of all, it's going to be Mike Bardou from the National Weather Service. Joe Moore is also here, the Battalion Chief from the Orland Park Fire District. And Mike Dorrance, also a firefighter from Orland Park, and he's also with the Will County EMA. And joining us also is Brianna McBride, a Senior Vice President with Hub International, to talk about both insurance and the weather. So those are the people who will be joining us as we get underway. So I'd like to start out with kind of a round table and just have each of them say a little something about themselves and do an introduction. So Mike, you're first up. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do before we start the questions.
Well, good evening, Andy, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me this evening. My name is Mike Bardou. I'm the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the National Weather Service office over in Romeoville. What that basically means is I'm kind of the public liaison with a lot of our partners, such as police, fire, emergency management, and so forth. And one of our main objectives is to provide information to help you help yourselves protect lives and property. That's one of our core mission values. So excited to be here tonight, excited to talk a little bit about the weather and certainly how we can prepare for it.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to have you here. You and I have known each other for years. We've attended conferences together. And so we'll have a lot of valuable information to share with those who are viewing the program tonight. Okay, let's talk about what's happening locally as well in the fire department. We're going to talk to Joe Moore, who's the Battalion Chief. So Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself and the role that you play.
There we go. Joe Moore, 25-year member of Orland Park Protection District Fire Service, about 30 years. Currently, I work on one of the shifts in charge of the battalion chief in charge of the shift, help coordinate the shift of 6 stations with about 30 firefighters per day, coordinating the response with 5 ambulances, 4 engines, and 2 trucks as we respond to whatever calls for service and helping out the community. Also involved with some of the emergency management relationship with the villages of Orland Hills and Orland Park, as well as Orland Township. Also involved with the state response team. And, you know, weather's important when we have to deal with anything and plan for stuff during the days.
Okay, well, thank you. We're a pleasure to have you here tonight and that introduction. Also joining you tonight from the Orland Park Fire Department is Mike Dorrance, and Mike is also with the Will County EMA. So let's say good evening to Mike. Hi there.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here. I've been with the Orland Fire Protection District for about the last year or so. And prior to that, I was with the Barrington Fire Department for about 4 years. In addition to that, I've been with Will County EMA for about the last 8, where I currently serve as a lieutenant with their Field Services Division. With that division, I help respond to numerous different types of weather events all throughout Will County, as well as bordering into Cook County and all of their incidents also. I have a passion for weather myself. I go ahead and get together with a few buddies and storm chase locally and nationally occasionally. And from there, I'm happy to share what knowledge I have and happy to contribute to this panel.
Excellent. Happy to have you, and would love to pick your brain about that storm chasing for sure. Okay, well, part of this discussion tonight is also going to be focusing on insurance, because they two go hand in hand. Oftentimes, most of us will file a claim or claims in the course of our lifetime. So let's talk to Brianna now, who's going to be discussing weather and its association with insurance. So Brianna, how are you this evening?
I am wonderful. Thank you for having me. I work with Hub International in the personal lines sector. Therefore, homeowners insurance, auto insurance, valuable articles, and protecting those assets primarily in especially storm situations like these, protection from wildfires, wind, hail, so on and so forth. I've been with Hub for 10 years and have been practicing this line of insurance for over 20. I'm very familiar with coastal, local, Midwest. I'm so happy to dive into any questions that may come up.
Okay, I'm guessing there's going to be a few of those because, as I mentioned, at one time or another in your lifetime, you're going to be filing a claim that's weather related, I'm sure. Either it's going to be hail, it may be flooding, maybe any kind of a severe weather event from lightning strikes to perhaps a tornado. So we'll be touching base with you on that in just a moment. But we'll start out focusing primarily on the weather right now. And my colleague and friend, Mike Bardou, let's talk a little bit about the extremes that we've been seeing as of late. I know that we're using new terminology in the last 10 years that viewers and those who are having to deal with the weather every day have not heard before, like cyclone bombs, for example. We're talking about the polar vortex. Derechos have been around for some time. But let's talk about the increase in activity. Is it about the same? Has it increased? And do we anticipate that there'll be more of this going forward? So, Mike, what's the latest on the thinking from the National Weather Service about this?
Sure, we've certainly seen our share of what we would consider active weather years or very active weather years over the last decade and even longer. You mentioned terms like the polar vortex and bomb cyclogenesis and bomb cyclones and things, and derechos, which we're all very familiar with now, thanks to August 10th. And those are terms that have been around for a long time, and they've kind of come more to the public eye with the advent of mass media, social media, smartphones, and so on. But there are some trends locally that tell us we've had kind of more weather extremes. A couple things that are notable that we've noticed, for the local Chicago area, even over the past 20 to even 40 years, is a steady increase in the overall amount of rainfall. And this is looking at yearly averages. We've seen an increase in that, and therefore we've actually seen an increase in stream flows, the amount of water running through creeks and rivers. That's increased actually anywhere from, I made a couple notes, even from 20 to 50% since the 1950s. So what that tells us is that rainfall amount is increasing. We're putting more water into the rivers. So some of that has to do with urbanization and so forth too. But the trend is steadily up. We've also seen kind of an interesting stat that people may not think of very much is a steady increase in the warmth of overnight low temperatures. So we're not cooling off as much at night as we maybe did 30, 40, 50 years ago. High temperatures, there really isn't, in terms of the daytime high temperatures, not really a noticeable trend, but the nighttime temperatures are something that's very interesting. And that becomes critical, especially when we get into warm summers. And incidentally, the summer of 2020 was the warmest summer in Chicago on record.
Yeah.
Not a lot of extremely hot days. I think our highest temperature was 97, but a lot of days above 90. And then a lot of overnight lows, so more early morning temperatures that were, say, in the 70s. So not a lot of time to recover from the previous day's heat. And that can have a stress on the human body and certainly be very dangerous as we get into some of those extremes. So we're seeing a lot of increases in the magnitudes of some of our weather. And not to continue to ramble on, but other rainfall stats has kind of maybe been where we've seen the biggest impact. May 2020 was the second consecutive May where we broke the all-time May rainfall record. So we first broke it in 2019, and then we did the same thing even further in 2020.
I think one of the things I'd like to point out as well is we're talking about how last year was the hottest year on record, not only here in Chicago, but across the country. And globally, we're talking about some of the highest temperatures ever recorded. And to that end, I want to point out that this isn't something that's new. We have had record-breaking climate conditions for some time. I've been around a long time, as long as you have as well, and then some. But I go back to, let's see, was it 1988? Was that the hottest summer? When we had, I believe it was 47 days of 90 plus temperatures. I might be off by the year, but I think it's pretty close to that area. Do you recall that?
I think 88 was one of the biggest ones in terms of duration, in terms of singular impact event. 95 is another one. where we had lots and dozens of lives lost. But as an
Yeah.
overall summer, 88 was a big one. Was actually the one of the years that got me into weather. I was a kid about 7 years old. I grew up outside of Cleveland, and we didn't have air conditioning, but we had a basement, and the basement always stayed cool. So my daily routine was going upstairs and going outside, riding my bike in circles till I got too hot, back in the basement. So a big drought, big hot year got me into weather. So it wasn't thunderstorms, it was actually drought.
Well, let me ask you this. How has the changes that we've seen recently made your job and my job more difficult, and for all of the other forecasters at the Weather Service locally? Because we should mention you're out of the Chicago Forecast Office, which is located in Romeoville.
Weather's always a challenge, and it's always something different, and that's what makes it interesting, I think, for people who are interested in the weather and practice the weather, such as you and I do. And so one of the biggest challenges is the expectations that people have of accuracy. We're always getting more accurate, believe it or not. We're never going to be 100% right. That's the only thing I can actually 100% guarantee you. But looking out further and further. And so as we get more complex, some of the weather gets more complex, we get into some of these extremes, it is more difficult to sometimes get the message across that we're expecting an extreme event, something out of the ordinary, something that might be rare. Getting 6-7 inches of rain in a 4 or 6 hour period on a Sunday afternoon in Chicago and flooding the river. Forecasting that in the first place is very difficult, but then getting the message out there that, hey, this is unusual and you need to take special attention to this is always a challenge.
Okay, so we're talking obviously about a lot more rain, but interestingly enough, this winter so far, we've seen very little snowfall. And temperatures, as you mentioned, have been relatively mild. This week has been a perfect example if you think about it. We talked about our overnight lows. We're generally around 16 or 17 degrees for our overnight low this time of year. Well, we've been averaging closer to about 30 or 32, which is more like our daytime high. And even though temperatures during the day haven't moved much, as you pointed out, it's been those overnight lows that have been consistently warmer and warmer. And now we're talking more rainfall. But conversely, with less snow, do they offset each other or not really in the long run?
The interesting thing about snow is we look at this year, which we've had very little snow, but last year I think we had 45 or 46 inches, so 2019 into 2020. So that's an above normal snow year within what we would consider typical. That's a typical range for us. 36 to 45 or 50 inches is what we see often, but it was more. And so where are we going to end up this year is still a bit of a wild card. La Nina, which is maybe a term you've heard, is influencing our winter. We've started to see a more active pattern, which is characteristic of that. It's been mostly in the form of liquid rain, or in some cases freezing rain and sleet versus snow. But that active period is going to keep us, stay with us probably. And if we stay on the milder side of these systems, then we're looking at less snow. But it wouldn't take much to shift things. We look at some of the snow that we've seen up in Milwaukee, going up north of the Quad Cities into southeast Minnesota. They've had quite a bit. And so we shift that 100, 150 miles in our direction. It's a very different winter for us, but the overall precipitation on kind of a yearly basis, the melted snow or the liquid rain has certainly been trending up.
Let me ask you one final question before I move on to some of the other panelists. If you had to pick one particular thing that relates to the weather in terms of its impact on people, what one thing do you think that is? I know what mine is.
Well, what's yours? Let's hear yours first.
Mine is freezing rain.
Yeah, that's probably the worst because it doesn't take much, a little bit of drizzle, frozen road surface temperatures, and it's a literal skating rink. And we've seen that. That's one interesting thing too, and I don't have an exact stat for it, but over the past 2 or 3 years, we've probably issued more freezing or ice storm warnings than we probably have in the previous decade or so. So there's kind of been more of an increase in some of that frozen precipitation, freezing rain and iciness or sleet, snow pellet, that type of thing than maybe we've typically seen.
Okay, so we'll slide off of that, pun intended, and move over to Brianna for a second and talk about that very thing. When you have slick conditions with icing and or torrential downpours and flooding and or severe thunderstorms, damaging winds, hail, lightning, and tornadoes, that all has a direct impact on homeowners. So let's focus on how that impacts you and what you can do to better prepare your home and what you can do to maybe mitigate some of those conditions going forward. So Brianna, we'll toss the ball over to you and let you address a couple of those issues. Give us some advice as what we can do to be better prepared for weather-related issues when it comes to insurance coverage.
Sure. I think I'm going to stick primarily to the Midwest and our issues with snow and heavy rainfall and temperature out of our control. So I highly suggest devices be installed, such as low temperature monitoring devices, especially if the resident is not going to be at the home for certain lengths of time. Water detection devices that can also turn off the water should you not be at home. As we all know, water, flooding, sump pump failures are our #1 claim across the board, no doubt about it. So
I didn't.
Pardon me?
I said, I didn't know that. That's pretty amazing.
Absolutely. Even simple things as sump pump devices. Many fail to install those. That's an issue. Also battery backups. Simple things like those tend to be inexpensive, prevent monstrosities of losses, the excessiveness that can come about. And on top of it, can also help reduce insurance premiums, which many might not know that does.
Okay. Is that something that your insurance agent would point out to you when you're buying your insurance, or is it something you have to be knowledgeable enough to ask?
It's definitely more of a knowledgeable to ask. I strongly recommend being with an agent that's more of an advisor that asks these types of questions instead of more just the transactional. We need to be better protecting of our assets that we have worked so hard to build.
Okay. When you purchase insurance, does the umbrella, if you don't mind, cover everything, or is it kind of like you get to pick and choose? And what would be the best way to go in your professional opinion?
Sure. An umbrella as a whole is actually more focused on the liability portion of insurance coverages. So we're talking about a lawsuit, be it via someone slips and falls at the home, possibly during an ice storm.
Yes.
Also an automobile accident. When there's a lawsuit involved, that umbrella would then come into play, which is protecting your assets as well. When we're talking about customizing a home product, those are absolutely customizable. You can increase certain, let's say, water backup limits for sump pump failure. You know, the #1 call that we get is that the basement has flooded. I like to rein that in because in all homeowners contracts, flood is actually excluded. So we need to be aware that there are two separate entities of flood versus water backup. So if the water is coming up through your sewer and drains, that's an optional endorsement that's also not built in, but that most should recommend.
Okay. So you're saying that if you have flooding, it's water backup. That's a separate coverage in your policy versus if you actually have torrential rains and your house floods.
Absolutely. And as Mike was discussing, the amount of water that we are getting and seeing in these rainstorms, flood is way more susceptible now and probable. So we need to be aware that that's going to be water from the outside in. So when we talk about the streams and the grass is not able to absorb as much as it used to, flood is an option and it should be talked about, even if you're not in a high hazard flood zone.
Okay. So now when you purchase flood insurance, that's a separate entity then, but does your general homeowners insurance coverage cover all types of weather events? Lightning strikes that would create fire or damage, wind and shingles, for example, perhaps a tornado. Does that come as part of your coverage, or do you have to buy these as separate items as well?
Sure. Those 2 or 3 items that you just mentioned absolutely are typically built into the homeowner's contract. There are items such as flood, earthquake, potentially additional mold, things to that nature that are absolutely excluded, and you would need to purchase. Possibly in the Midwest, maybe not earthquake is as alarming as other parts of the country. But yes, you're common what we would think. Windstorm, shingle, hail damage is extremely common on cars and homes.
Yeah.
But
yeah, no question about it. I think almost at one point or another in your lifetime, if you live somewhere long enough, including the Midwest, you're likely to get hail damage. Sometimes it's relatively minor, and other times your car is literally beaten to its point where it can't be used anymore, and they basically total it, correct?
Absolutely. And on that same vein of hail damage, also you want to be sure you're with an insurance carrier that's actually going to replace the roof and not potentially fix the issue. And now we have a matched situation, including siding. That's also very important.
Okay, terrific. Any other advice that you'd like to share with those who are participating with us tonight? What's the one thing that you think that they need to know about insurance and coverage when it comes to the weather?
I think it's important to actually reach out to your agent and ask these types of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I think so many of us assume that you have a homeowner's product or you have a condo product and it's what you need. And I think it's important to run these scenarios that may keep you awake at night with your agent.
Okay, terrific. Appreciate that.
We have actually 2 questions that came in that have to do with insurance. And are you able to see the Q&A?
I do not see it, but perhaps Brianna.
Yes.
You can see? Okay.
Okay. My question is, I'm sure Andy can chime in as well, but speaking of extreme weather, should I be looking into having tsunami insurance? Lake Michigan is close in the event of an earthquake. I just want to have all my bases covered. My basement has flooded in the past, and we've seen in 2020 anything can happen. I would say good question, but not likely. I think we're okay there. And then the second one is, during a tornado, should you go to the basement or crawl space higher up or an inside room on a main floor? Not really insurance related, so I'm not sure. I would assume from my youth that you should go in the basement, but I don't know the actual answer to that question.
Okay, I'll jump in and give you a hand there. Well, we're not likely to have a tsunami here along Lake Michigan, but because it is such a large body of water and basically a small ocean, we will have what we typically call a seiche, which is a rising of the water with sloshing effect. If you think of the atmospheric pressure on the northern portion of a lake pushing down, it surges the water to the south side and actually overlaps. And as Mike had alluded to before, with all the torrential rain that we're seeing these days, flooding is becoming much more common. And so, while not a tsunami, we do get that water washing inland and actually going inland in rivers now and backing them up as well, kind of reversing the flow. We'll have Mike talk more about that in just a moment. So those are some of the things that we obviously have to worry about. In terms of the tornado question, again, you always want to go to the interior of your home. You want to put as many walls between you and the outside of the house as possible and stay away from all windows. If you have a basement, you always want to go to the basement. If you do not, then you want to go to the interior level. If you have a 2-story home, never stay on the upper level, as you're safer in the center section of the house. A bathroom is always a really good place to go. If you have time to grab a mattress and cover yourself in the tub, that would be an ideal situation. But if you have a crawl space or you have a basement, that's always the ideal objective, and you want to go there. So at least we got to cover a few of those questions. Okay, let's focus now on first responders, because they're a critical part of helping you deal with the weather, and of course fire, which oftentimes is associated with the weather. When we get into droughts, when we have lightning strikes, and when we have flooding, things can explode, gas leaks, that type of thing. So now we're going to turn to Joe and to Mike from the Orland Park Fire District, and they're going to address some of those issues for us. So gentlemen, when it comes to the weather, we'll start with you, Joe. What is the one thing that the Orland Park Fire Department has to contend with most?
So I think the last year recently, with some of those drought, it's been grass fires and brush fires and things starting because of, it gets really dry, and then smoking materials is even along the railroads, even the sparks from the tracks can set off little brush fires. So those have been things that have become an issue. Landscaping with a lot of the, beautification projects that have happened is within buildings or even up and down roadways. There's a lot of little pieces of vegetation that get extremely dry, and one little match or a cigarette, and we get a little bit of a fire. Sometimes they're a nuisance fire. Sometimes they can get very large depending on wind and other things going on. So that's been one of the larger problems with the drier weather around here. And then, as you mentioned, with the winter weather, it hasn't been as bad as before. I mean, we were talking before at the station in 2011, we had that really big snowstorm where it was like almost like a hurricane level. We lost some roofs. We had all that snow. I mean, lightning strikes during the summer. Those are some of the other concerns that happen for response for us to go out the door and have to deal with stuff. I don't know if Mike has anything else that he remembers or to add.
One thing that I did want to add is definitely the presence and increase in flash flooding. And flash floods, especially in regards to roadways and ensuring that people don't be driving throughout those flooded roadways and embodying that message from the National Weather Service: turn around and don't drown.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this, being a firefighter and a first responder, how has COVID impacted you and your fellow firefighters in your job on a daily basis?
So when we, especially for the EMS world, when we went to a call and if you start being a paramedic, you wear gloves, sometimes you wear goggles, you protect yourself because you're treating patients. And then when we would get notification that someone had meningitis or something really highly infectious, there was other levels of dress that we would do, but it was rarely, or it would be seasonal. And we do what we could to protect ourselves, mask on a patient.
Mhm.
But since COVID's hit, every call has been like it's a highly infectious disease. We're adding levels of protection on every EMS call just to protect ourselves, because we don't know, or at least our paramedics are doing their best to make sure we're not the people transmitting from person to person, and they don't want to bring that home with them as well. That includes now regular calls. We go for CO calls or fire alarms, or even help get someone who's locked out of their house. The guys are wearing a level of protection now that they used to wear just on EMS calls. They're wearing on regular fire calls because it's that level of protection. That just adds some PPE that we've had to purchase and get, and the guys have had to wear and keep track of and use. I'm sure Mike's had more experience on the ambulance lately than I have, and he can probably tell you a little bit more about just how that's impacted just communication, because your mask hinders your ability to, see everyone's face, see your smile, or anything else that reassurance on the ambulance.
Okay, no, that's a solid point. Appreciate that. Let me ask you another question. What can the average homeowner do to better prepare themselves for fire situations at home or to prevent them?
So through a lot of our safety programs, the basic things is, having smoke detectors, CO detectors in a home.
Mhm.
But when you use cooking and you do anything in the house, be able to do it safely. Good maintenance program at home, cleaning of dryer vents, HVAC systems. You're making sure that things are picked up safely. People we've talked about when refinishing floors, making sure they discard of that type of material safely. It goes in this container, because we've had people do a nice job on their floors and put everything in the garage, and then the rags start to decompose and they've caught fire, and then their garage is on fire. So there's just those things that you do on a daily basis. You just have to be able to be aware of doing things correctly, and just having good maintenance program within your house to make sure that those little things don't cause a problem. We've had people self-clean their oven and forget they left stuff in the oven, and that's a problem. So it's just those little things about being aware and keeping things out of the way for, to cause harm for kids and things like that.
Can we ask you about space heaters? Because obviously we're in the winter season, and at times we lose power. People are always looking for alternative ways to heat their homes. And space heaters, as we hear on a regular basis, cause fires and ultimately deaths for some. Would you recommend that people not use them at all, especially inside when the power is out?
So when the power's out, using a space heater is probably a lot better than trying to use your oven. But and because people use any heating source to try and keep heat in the house. What problem with space heaters? I mean, they are, if they're done right, they're very good, but it's keeping them away from combustibles. They have to be 3-4 feet away from anything, and people try to start putting them towards the side of the room, because when they're in the middle of the room, you have to walk around it. And as the closer they put it to a wall, to a curtain, to a piece of furniture, that's where the problems start to arise. I mean, a lot of people in offices, and if your heat's not good, they have little ones that people put by them to keep them warm during the winter, depending on, again, how well their building works. And when you do it at your house, it's just the added problems of whether or not it's used correctly. Our big key is usually when the power goes out, people start using generators and they put them inside their garage, and that creates carbon monoxide in the home. And that's a totally different issue, because you don't smell it. I mean, you'll smell the generator, but we really don't smell CO, and that's what can cause problems, and it has caused deaths and people to get very sick.
Are generators typically installed by professional installers, or is it something that the average layperson can do themselves?
So if you use a portable generator, that's something you can use on your own. If you have one installed, it is recommended that we'd have it done by a professional, and those are usually the ones that then are on the outside of the house. use natural gas. There's a switch that turns on within a certain amount of time after the power goes out to keep a house generated. And I would definitely recommend it be done by someone who knows what they're doing, because otherwise if it switches over, you can backfeed the house and that can cause other electrical problems and things to then short out. And then again, if you're using a portable one, and I know I have one here for my home, if I use it, I have it the right cord to set up to go to the right places to keep it outside the house, just to make sure it's not going to cause any other problems.
Okay, this question is for firefighter Mike. I know that training is a critical part of what you do on a regular basis and it's ongoing, but you provide training programs as well for the average person. Is there something that you can provide them in terms of information that they can access the teaching programs that you have that would benefit them and their families?
In regards to the training programs, things like that, the Orland Fire Protection District does offer CPR classes and things along those lines. As for weather preparedness and courses and preparation in regards to that, I know there's a bunch of great resources available through numerous partnerships. One's through Chicago, it's gearupandgetready.org or gearupgetready.org, and then also through FEMA, they have numerous different programs and pamphlets and different things that you can go through to help prepare yourselves at ready.gov.
Okay, I wanted to pose a question for each of you, and you can think about it, and then I'll come back to you to get your answer. But at one point or another, we all encounter some very unusual weather event in our lives. And so I'll ask you to tell us what your most interesting weather event was that you had to go through personally. And I'm going to actually start with Mike Bardou, so we'll switch over to him for a second, and then we'll talk a little bit more about extreme weather and how it impacts local conditions around the Chicago area in terms of the severe weather season, tornadoes, lightning, and that type of thing, and hail. And one of the things I want to touch on is also known as an inversion, because we get trapped in these low-grade cloud periods this time of year, and people are always saying, I'm not quite sure how that works. So Mike, we're going to go back to you for a second. Let's pick on you and say, what is the one event above all others that you remember that happened to you personally?
I think it's probably the groundhog blizzard of 2011.
You stole my thunder.
Sorry about that. That was, there's blizzards and then there's blizzards, and that is still one of the most incredible snowstorms I remember. I lived in Minnesota and worked there for a few years. I grew up outside of Cleveland. We get a lot of snow there, and just the wind, the lack of visibility was just incredible. I was working the day shift. I was fortunate to be able to head home before the storm, or just as it was starting. And then my wife and I ordered dinner out, literally around the corner. I drove out of the garage, was going to go turn down the street to go pick up dinner. Couldn't see anything. I said, this is not a good idea. Backed it in the driveway, and we were hunkered down until the next day when I went out to clear the snow, and hip high drifts and all that. Just the wind, the lightning, the thunder, the duration was just something else. Not many to compare to that. I wasn't around in for like 67 or 78 or 79, but this was something for sure.
Okay, well, I too have been around for a long time, but wasn't here for that one. But you're right, that would have been my first choice, because I worked that night into that morning, and that's when we had our broadcast facility on Michigan Avenue. And I had to go, I spent the night in the city, and I typically get to work in the wee hours of the morning, but I had to walk from my hotel to NBC Tower. And we probably had 60 or 65 mile an hour wind gusts. I mean, literally the snow was horizontal. And I remember the lightning and the thunder, and the sky was being illuminated, and it was just snowing to beat the band. And I will never forget that for as long as I live. It was the most amazing experience, hands down. So if you were not here for that, trust me, it was the blizzard to end all blizzards, at least in my lifetime. And we could tell that Mike thinks the same as well. Okay, so let's jump over to Brianna for a second and see if she's got a weather story as well. And for you who are watching, if you've got one, just send us a quick one-liner about what it was. Brianna, what did you have to deal with?
I would say the craziest experience was growing up, and speaking of basements, I hate to go into the insurance world, but our basement actually flooded 5 feet of water. So washer, dryer, everything bobbing along. It was quite the disaster. Learned a lot from it. And it was a wild experience, but we survived it. And this is why I'm a big proponent of sump pumps.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Joe, let's pick on you now. What is the one particular weather event that you recall that had a greatest impact on you?
Well, 2011 was stolen already, but we had guys actually in snowmobiles to help respond to calls because of
Mhm,
how that snow came down, as
mhm,
well as snow plows leading companies into calls that during that those next 2 days. But when I began in Orland in 1996, we had an extreme flooding event that happened where those storms trained all the way from Naperville through the Orland
mhm,
area. I was coming on duty the morning and the tones went out for extra coverage for manpower because the calls were already starting before I got to work. And
mhm.
I had to zigzag my way through Orland because 143rd was flooded, Wolf Road was flooded, and then parts of the mall was flooded, which was not normal. And by the time we got in, we kept 2 shifts on duty for the beginning of the day because we had flooding in a whole bunch of areas in the Fernway subdivision over between
Mhm.
Orland Hills and Orland Park, as well as off Regent Drive in Orland by just south of the mall. That whole area was just inundated with flooding. And that was a long day of just going from call to call to call. And we transported a couple of people to the hospital, and that was an adventure as well,
Mhm.
because even getting to the hospital was a zigzag of trying to find a street open to get an ambulance to the hospital. So that was a huge day of weather impacting everyone for a long time.
Okay, so let's now shift over to firefighter Mike. What is your particular one-day event that you recall like no other in your lifetime?
My one-day event, separate from a storm chasing venture or anything like that, would have to be a microburst that occurred in Lockport. I think it was around 2007, 2008 or so, where there was widespread damage, widespread debris, and many roads were closed, and a significant amount of the town had lost power for a while. And growing up and being in high school at that time, it was a direct impact, and community really came together to help out their neighbors, and it was great to help be part of that coalition of help, and may have driven me a little bit more towards my my career path in public safety.
Okay, excellent. Appreciate that. So I'm going to jump back over to Mike now from the National Weather Service. Mike, I want to focus a little bit on the derecho that we had last year in August, because even though we've had them in the past, that one really stood out. So let's talk about the conditions that took place on that particular day, if you recall, and tell us a little bit more about what that is exactly, how it comes to pass, and why does it last as long as it does and causes the destruction that it does.
Well, derecho is kind of a special category for straight line windstorms that affect very large areas. And there's certain criteria. We're looking for basically swaths of continuous damage that extend at least 400 miles and have at least a 60-mile width. So we're talking, covering pieces of states, if not multiple states. And that's what we saw with the August 10th derecho. It started out in eastern Nebraska, really ramped up in Iowa. And they had, I think, the peak wind, I think I saw was 126 miles an hour. Now, this isn't wind that's swirling like a tornado. This is blowing in a straight line. So people often underestimate severe thunderstorm warnings, things that we issue for straight line winds, but they can certainly get to that magnitude. It got into Illinois, was still causing a lot of damage, a lot of 90+ mile per hour winds. And then it kind of shifted gears a little bit into our area. The swaths of the really extreme wind, 80+ mile per hour winds kind of narrowed. And we started to see more tornadoes develop. They were on the lower end of the scale. Out of a scale of 5, they were 0 to 2, but there were about 15 of them just in our forecast area, which covers 23 counties. And then a lot of other areas had 50, 60, maybe 70 mile per hour winds. But certainly, especially in the south part of the metro, from Orland going east through southern Cook County, Harvey was especially hard hit. There was a couple tornadoes in that area, as well as 90-mile+ per hour straight line wind corridor that came across. And so we had people without power for even a week or more in some spots. We had extensive tree damage, extensive crop damage, especially across Iowa. And I believe it's number 2 on the billion-dollar disasters list for 2020, following Hurricane Laura, I think was the top billion-dollar disaster. So not just in the Chicago area, but across the Midwest as a whole. So certainly an extreme system. Not uncommon. We've had derechos in recent years, not quite that extreme, but 2012 was a big one. 2014 was another one. So we're not immune to these things.
So we focus on derechos and the wind damage, but let's not focus on the other force that is a hurricane. Boy, 2020 was just amazing. I mean, hurricane after hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, and so many of them making landfall here in the US. So we're talking about derechos, we're talking about hurricanes, we're talking about increased river levels and lake levels because of all the rainfall. And the question that a lot of people would ask is, what is going on here? Is this in fact climate change, or is it just naturally occurring variability in the climate over decades or centuries? Do you have an opinion on that?
I'm not a climate forecaster, a climate expert by any stretch, but we look at what the trends we see locally, right, as a starting point. And we mentioned that the rainfall, the extremes, those 2 Mays in a row with record rainfall, and then the chief mentioned drought later in the year. We get really dry in the summer, and so it's in the distribution of the rainfall is another aspect of it. So maybe over the course of a year, we're not too far above normal, maybe, but we get a really busy month, really wet month, and then we're followed on the other side. So that's got a lot of impacts, agricultural and otherwise. We look globally. This was a tie with the warmest year on record globally with 2016, I believe it was. Increased number of hurricanes. That's as far as the climate experts, what they say, that's one of the things that we could see more frequency of. Kind of the extremes are kind of where the trend is forecast to go. And we're starting to see some of those in some of our own local data.
Okay, so I'm going to jump over to Brianna again for a second, and we'll talk about the increase in these more significant weather events. And you think that would go hand in hand with an increase in claims and damage? So let's find out if that's the case. Brianna, can you tell us if you and your company has seen a substantial increase, a minor increase, or things pretty much status quo in terms of claims and weather-related damage?
Sure. I would say in the Midwest, maybe a bit of an uptick, a little bit more on the hail side in particularly, but across the country, absolutely. Hurricanes, California has been quite keeping us extremely busy as far as the wildfires, mudslides, where it all derived, what's the trigger for insurance, and actually being as proactive as we possibly can to direct our clients onto how to actually mitigate further damage. It's interesting, some of our carriers actually do a really good job at having us on the radar where the wildfires are going, reaching them, even some spray retardant to help mitigate that fire. So absolutely in other parts of the country, in the Midwest, pretty normal.
Okay. Now I want to go back to Mike and Joe and ask you a question. In terms of weather and firefighting, is there a particular season that makes your job more difficult, or no, it doesn't really matter whether it's winter, spring, summer, or fall? Firefighting is firefighting under any and all circumstances. Who wants to take that question?
So I'll defer to Mike after, but I know that the extremes are what's caused the problem. As it gets really hot, those guys heat up extremely quickly in that gear. And we've had guys pass out. We had a bad fire on July 4th that was 100 degrees, and guys who usually can do 2 bottles of air and go back in after 1 bottle, they were done, and we were recycling people in quickly. And then we had a fire in the winter in 2015 that it was so cold, the hydrants were frozen, and we had trouble getting water. And then after those guys put the fire out, during the firefighting, you're warm, fire's keeping you warm, everything's moving, a lot of adrenaline. And then after that stops, that stuff freezes up on you, and you got a couple extra pounds, and you are just moving like a snail because you're carrying all that extra weight and you're getting very cold. So those extremes really hurt you as you move on. I'm sure Mike can relate some more.
Yes, indeed. Echoing what Chief Morris said, it is definitely the extremes that make our job the most difficult. The heat and making sure that we're staying hydrated and trying to counter for all that extra heat, not only outside, but also inside the building. The firefighting structural gear that we wear is getting better at dissipating heat, but as time goes on, it still takes its toll. And then come winter time, like Chief Morris said, frozen hydrants and trying to secure a water supply can definitely prove to become a challenge. And then even after the fire is out, that gear definitely does get heavy. There's been numerous times where you'd look at the corner of your helmet and you have your own icicles hanging off your helmet there.
Now, I'm going to ask you about camaraderie within the fire department. I would assume that because you are oftentimes in life-threatening situations, you really rely on the person that's next to you. Do you spend a lot of quality time together outside of the firehouse, or do you spend so much time together in the firehouse that once you all go home to your respective families, that's it for the day? Thanks, I've seen you enough, bye.
It's changed over the years. You know, when firefighting really early on was very much volunteer, depending on your department. Volunteer departments, those are very close-knit groups
Mhm.
because it's the community coming together to keep things going. And as the job has become more professional and we get people from farther away, I don't think it's gone. I just think it's a smaller groups. And, you know, firehouses that work together for 24 hours, those groups get kind of close. The shifts of all 6 guys, maybe not as much, but they're still kind of close. Um, it's just those demands between family and work.
Mhm.
You know, as guys get older, I think it kind of separates a little bit. But the younger guys, and Mike can say to this, is that there's some really tight groups of guys because you know what, that is a person that you're counting on. I've seen very interesting arguments in a firehouse about some of the silliest things. You know, they say they'll fight over their sugar, who's got what, but when the alarm comes off, they'll help each other out and go after each other to make sure that they can survive to the next day and work together for the community. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
I want to know, and this will we'll start with you, Joe, and then we'll go over to Mike about this particular question. How has firefighting changed from when you first started versus training for today?
There's a lot more safety built into firefighting than there was before. When I started, guys had just been getting off the tailboard because you used to ride in the back of the fire engine to the call. And I was in there. There was the back, or the dog house as they call it, was open. So in the winter, you would have to put all your gear on to drive from one place to the other because you would freeze in the back while the guys in the cab were like warm. And in the summer you would melt. But you know, those safety features of the vehicle got better. It's air conditioned, it's heated, it's enclosed, it's a lot better for the guys. Hearing protection, there's a lot more that's gone on for our safety, as well as making systems better for us to do our job a little bit easier. And the technology is a lot, it's amazing what we've done in the world of EMS, because the Life Pack 4s or 3s that I started with were small little oscilloscope of, you're trying to guess what that rhythm was. And now we have machines that we do 12 lead EKGs, and we can tell you exactly what's going on before we transport you to the hospital. So it's been amazing what's happened in the past 30 years.
Okay, Mike, can you follow up on that? What have you experienced more recently?
Most definitely. I've been in the fire service for a total of 5 years now, and even during my time, I've seen some great cultural shifts in regards to the importance of mental health, critical incident stress debriefing, and really focusing on making sure that everyone continues to be the best that they can be. And in addition to that, the other initiative that has really started to take a strong foothold is cancer prevention. And as a firefighter, we're exposed to many different types of carcinogens, and taking additional action, ensuring that we are decontaminating ourselves and taking those extra precautionary steps to help reduce our risk. That's definitely one of the biggest impacts that I've seen in my time.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. I'm going to switch over now to Mike Bardou one more time, and we're going to talk about the collaboration, because you talk about firefighters and watching out for each other. It's also a home at the National Weather Service, and the group of people that work together are some of the best professionals in the world when it comes to what they do. So Mike, let's focus on that. Tell us a little more about the team that you work with and the schedules that you keep, because you're watching the skies 24/7, 365, because we all know weather happens anytime, any day, every day of the year. Mike?
Well, that's absolutely true. Anytime, any place, for any kind of weather, really. Like you said, we're 24/7. So our forecasters work rotating shifts. So you go from days to evenings to mids and back and forth through all those. We usually have 2 to 3 people on a shift at our office. We've got about 22 people in total between forecasters, a couple electronics experts and technicians, a computer programming expert, and some management and administrative staff as well, and a hydrologist, like I said, in addition to the forecasters that we have. So we're a pretty tight group. You know, when you have a fairly small office covering a very populous area, we certainly get busy, and it gets certainly hectic at times. A lot of coming in on days off, staying late, coming in early, and things like that, because like you said, the weather's always busy, but we're all kind of weather geeks at heart. That's why most of us got into it. and we get along really well. And we work with a lot of great folks. The Chicago media, Rockford media, our two biggest media groups. We work very closely with them. We're very fortunate to have a great relationship with all the media outlets, all the stations, and certainly with you and Channel 5. The public safety folks, we're getting to know more of them all the time between emergency management, police, fire, especially at the county level. We're working at the community level, but we've got a lot of great partnerships there. And then with our neighboring weather service offices too. It's always good to bounce ideas back and forth, make sure we're thinking along the same lines about this part of the state versus another part of the state and so on. So a lot of camaraderie, a lot of good partnerships, a lot of good collaboration.
I think that one of the things I'd like to point out here, especially over the last 10 years or so, is the reach or the outreach on your behalf and the Weather Service behalf to the media, and have created this partnership that allows us to collaborate on a more daily and regular basis, especially when we're talking about significant and life-threatening events, which seem to become more common, it appears, these days. And so kudos to you and to the staff at the National Weather Service office, which is in Romeoville. And you provide other services as well as forecasting on a daily basis. And I would like you just to touch on those for a second. If a person or people are interested in finding out more about the weather and they want to have some of the programs, or have you, for example, or one of the other forecasters come and talk to them, is there an avenue by which they can do that?
There is. And right now with COVID, we're all virtual, but we have some student programs, especially for college students that want to go into meteorology or are studying it. We do a lot of public outreach. Probably the most known one is our Storm Spotter training program. Each year we train between 2,000 and 3,000 storm spotters across the area. We're going to be announcing those virtual classes coming up in probably the next week or two. They're going to be in February and March, again, all online. But we're probably most known for those. We partner with a lot of folks. DuPage County, for instance, they host the annual severe weather seminar that's on hiatus for this year too. And other programs. We work more internal with our direct partners, especially in the emergency management community. We've started to do a lot more training and exercise with them in the past 5 years or so, and with the communities to help them prepare. And I'll also point out one of those programs for communities is the Storm Ready program. Orland Park, as well as Will County and Cook County are all storm ready communities and counties. And real quick about what that means they've taken steps to make sure that they've got a hazardous weather plan. They've got communications that are set up, and they're ready to be aware of the weather. They're ready to be able to deal with it and help everyone in the community stay safe and recover from whatever does happen. So a lot of outreach that we try to do. Social media and remote outreach is one of our biggest venues. Of course, we're NWS Chicago on Facebook and Twitter, for a cheap plug, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
A lot of good information. But like you said, the media is our biggest mouthpiece. Without you folks, our message really doesn't get as far as it certainly does with you working with us all the time. So it's certainly appreciated.
And it's a wonderful collaboration, and I'm sure it will be for years and decades to come. I just really want to close by saying how much we appreciate the time that you put into this on a daily basis in forecasting the weather and tracking severe weather. But the main goal of the National Weather Service is pretty short and sweet, and you could probably compile that for us, is to protect life and property, correct?
That's our number one part of our mission, is to provide information to protect life and property. The second part of it, if you're interested, is to help enhance and promote the economy. Weather certainly relates to safety first and foremost, but there's a lot of trickle down results. We heard Brianna mention as well, there's a lot of dollars and cents involved too. So we want to help folks know what to do. We say be weather aware. We're trying to build a weather ready nation where folks they know what the forecast is. They have a plan in place for what they're going to do to help keep themselves and their family and their property as well safe ahead of time. And then they know when to activate that plan. And then when it does come time to have to recover, we're making the jobs of police and fire and EMS a little bit easier because we've been able to keep ourselves safe. So it's really all about awareness and planning ahead.
Okay, wonderful. That's a terrific positive note to end on, that's for sure. Any final questions out there? If there is, you just got to let us know. If not, we'll wrap up the program for now. Again, I do want to.
We have one question here. Someone wanted to know, where is the best place to live in the U.S. with climate change?
Well, having been in the business myself for almost 40 years, I can tell you that we're always saying to each other, yeah, your weather, it's a cakewalk. You ought to live where I live. It doesn't really matter where you live. At some point or another, the weather is going to be pretty extreme. And if you wanted to go someplace where the weather is considered to be more ideal, oftentimes I hear people say that San Diego is the place to go. But if you've ever lived in San Diego, you know that they too have their issues and problems. And in fact, many people who live in Southern California have earthquakes, mudslides, and floods, and a lot of other issues as well to deal with. So I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but having lived in a couple of places around the country, I will tell you this, that living in the Midwest, you will get to experience it all. When it comes to the weather, if you like change and you like variety, all you have to do is stay right here, because at one point or another, you're going to get to see just about all there is to see. And that is the absolute truth. Thank you to Mike from the National Weather Service. Thanks to Joe and Mike from the Orland Fire District, and Brianna for covering the insurance needs. And hopefully you've learned something. One of my favorite quotes that I often like to use when I go out and speak to students or other groups is Ben Franklin once said, "Some people are weather-wise, most are otherwise." Hopefully after this program, you're now weather-wise. So thanks for joining us this evening. We hope you learned something and took away some valuable information. Once again, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you everyone for coming. And if you came in a little bit late, we have this recorded so you could see some of the things that you may have missed. And I really need to give the thanks again, but thank you from the Orland Park Public Library, everybody, for coming out. Thank you to all the panelists and giving your expertise. This was very enjoyable and very informative. I hope you guys all have a great night, and goodbye, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.